At 0312 hours local time, the water inside Sevastopol Bay was almost completely still. A light fog sat over the surface, thick enough to swallow the shape of a hull at 400 meters, thin enough that the harbor lights still bled through it in soft orange smears. On the southern shore, a duty officer at the Black Sea Fleet headquarters was reviewing the same overnight report he had reviewed 100 times before. Boom nets closed, patrol boats on station, hydroacoustic sensors active, coastal radar scanning. On paper, Sevastopol was one of the most heavily protected naval anchorages in the world. What that report could not tell him was that 11 kilometers to the west, 5 unmanned surface vessels had already shut down their engines and were drifting silently on the current, waiting for a timing window that had been calculated 3 days earlier by a planning cell in Kiev. They had been in the water for over 9 hours. Launched far offshore from a converted fishing platform, they had crossed more than 200 kilometers of open sea at low speed, running dark, hugging the surface, spaced far enough apart that no single radar return could ever resolve them as a formation. Each one was roughly 6 meters long, barely wider than a bathtub, built from a fiberglass hull with a low freeboard and a matte finish designed to scatter rather than reflect. Above the waterline, they presented a radar cross-section smaller than a life raft. Below it, they carried between 300 and 400 kilograms of high explosive packed into the bow. The men controlling them were not at sea. They were sitting in a room several hundred kilometers away, watching low-bandwidth video feeds relayed through a satellite terminal, each operator responsible for a single vessel and nothing else. The picture they were looking at was grainy, monochrome, and delayed by a fraction of a second, which does not sound like much until you're trying to steer a boat at 40 knots through a gap in a barrier you cannot fully see. Most of the transit had been flown on autopilot along preloaded waypoints. Human hands only took over for the last few kilometers, and even then, the instructions given to them were remarkably simple. Reach the gap. Do not stop for anything. This mattered more than most people realize. A Russian Karakurt-class corvette cost somewhere north of $80 million. A Project 22160 patrol ship, a similar figure. The vessels drifting west of the harbor entrance cost roughly $200,000 each to build, and Ukraine could produce them in a workshop the size of a 2-car garage. The exchange rate of this war had been rewritten quietly over 18 months by people who never went to sea. At 0331, the lead vessel restarted its engine, not the outboard at full power, a low idle barely above the noise floor of the sea itself, driving the boat forward at 8 knots. The other 4 followed at 90-second intervals. They were not traveling in a line. They were traveling as a spread, nearly 2 kilometers apart at the widest point, converging on a single point at the harbor mouth like the fingers of a hand slowly closing. Inside the fleet's operations center, the first indication of anything unusual came not from radar, but from a hydroacoustic station on the northern breakwater. A technician saw a transient signal, a brief spike in the low-frequency band consistent with a small outboard motor. He logged it and moved on. Sevastopol is a working harbor. Small boats move through it constantly. Fishermen, port tugs, launches, carrying crews between anchorages. The signal lasted 4 seconds and vanished. It was not enough to justify waking a battery commander. 9 minutes later, the MR 352 positive radar on a patrol vessel moored near the inner harbor picked up a return at roughly 9 kilometers. Weak, intermittent, appearing on one sweep and gone on the next. The operator ran it through his clutter filters. Sea state 2, light chop. The signal behaved exactly like a wave crest catching the beam at the wrong angle. He classified it as clutter. He was not wrong to do so. On any of the previous 400 nights, he would have been correct. The problem with defending a harbor against surface drones is not detection technology. It is geometry. Radar energy travels in straight lines, and a target sitting 60 centimeters above the waterline is competing for attention with every single wave in a 9-kilometer arc. The Russians knew this. It was precisely why they had strung the harbor entrance with physical barriers. Because if you cannot reliably see the threat, you can at least build a wall it has to climb. Those barriers were serious. 2 lines of floating boom, each anchored to the seabed, running from the southern mole across the navigable channel to the northern breakwater. Steel cable cores, heavy plastic floats. Below the surface, anti-swimmer netting hanging down several meters. Behind them, a third line of concrete-anchored pontoons narrowing the transit gap to a corridor barely wide enough for a corvette to pass through under tug guidance. Any vessel entering Sevastopol Bay had to funnel through that corridor. Everyone knew it, including the people who had spent the last 4 months studying satellite imagery of it. That study had produced one specific conclusion, and it was not about where the gap was. It was about where the boom was weakest. Commercial imagery, refreshed every few days, showed exactly which sections had been repaired, which floats sat lower in the water than their neighbors, and where the anchor points sat relative to the shoreline. A barrier that looks continuous from a headquarters briefing slide is, up close, a chain of individually maintained segments with individually variable condition. The planners had picked their impact point months earlier, and they had picked it 200 meters away from the corridor everybody was watching. At 0344, the lead drone was 1,800 meters from the outer boom, and this is where the operation stopped being a transit and became an engagement. The first vessel did not slow down, it accelerated. From 8 knots to 32 in under 20 seconds, the outboard howling, the bow lifting clear of the water, its hull slamming across the chop toward the northern anchor point of the outer boom. On the patrol boat's radar screen, a signal that had been dismissed as clutter suddenly became a hard, fast-moving return, closing at 15 meters per second. The operator called it out. A klaxon sounded. The AK-630M mount on the patrol ship's afterdeck began traversing. But the first drone was never going to reach a ship. It was going to reach a rope. It struck the outer boom 200 meters north of the transit corridor and detonated. The blast lifted a column of water 30 meters into the air, shattered the float sections on either side of the impact, and severed the steel cable core. The boom did not disappear. It parted, and the current began pulling the two free ends apart, opening a gap that widened by the second. A 300-kilogram warhead had just done the work that would otherwise have required a demolition team, a support vessel, and total air superiority. Inside the harbor, everything changed at once. Sirens across the base, deck lights snapping on, crews running to gun mounts. The duty officer at fleet headquarters, still holding his overnight report, watched the plot on the main display go from empty to hostile in a single refresh cycle. And this is where the defense made its first real error. And it was a very human one. Every sensor, every gun, every set of eyes turned toward the point of the explosion. The northern anchor, the obvious threat axis, that was the direction the attack had come from. That was where the next one would come from. The second drone was already 3 kilometers to the south, running at 18 knots along the shoreline, hugging the cliffs beneath Cape Kherson, where the coastal radar's beam was blocked by its own terrain. It was not carrying a warhead at all. It was carrying a radar corner reflector and a small transmitter, and at 0347 it turned north and switched the transmitter on. On every Russian screen in the western approaches, a bright, stable, unambiguous surface contact appeared. Large return, steady course, 22 knots inbound. It looked exactly like what a surface drone would look like if a surface drone were being helpful. 2 patrol boats broke from the harbor mouth and turned toward it. The coastal ball missile battery north of the bay slewed its search radar south. Attention, which had been concentrated in one place, was now split into 2, and neither of them was the place that mattered. Drones 3, 4, and 5 went through the gap in the boom at 0349, running in a tight column at 40 knots, and they went through it in 11 seconds. The AK-630M on the patrol vessel had them. 6 rotating barrels, 30 millimeter, 5,000 rounds per minute, tied to an MR-123 Vimpel fire control radar that was designed precisely for this kind of terminal defense. It opened up on the lead vessel at 900 meters and hit it. Tracers walked across the water, found the hull, and the drone disintegrated in a flat orange flash that lit the entire inner harbor for a fraction of a second. The gunner had done everything right. His system worked exactly as designed. But the AK-630M has a cyclic rate and a traverse rate, and the two are not the same thing. It takes roughly 1.5 seconds to shift from one target to another and reestablish a firing solution. In 1.5 seconds, a drone traveling at 40 knots covers 30 meters. And there were 2 more, spread laterally, already inside the inner harbor, already past the point where the gun could fire without putting 30mm rounds into the pier, the fuel farm, and a moored auxiliary vessel behind them. The gunner had to make a decision that no training manual can prepare anyone for. He kept firing. A 3-second burst that caught the second drone across the port side and sent it veering hard, out of control, into the breakwater wall, where it detonated against solid concrete and did nothing but throw stone into the water. The rest of that burst continued past its target, stitched across the harbor surface, and threw sparks off a mooring bollard 40 meters from a fuel line. The ceasefire order came over the net 8 seconds later. The last drone kept going. Berth 12 sat on the northern side of the inner harbor, and moored alongside it was a Project 22160 patrol ship that had come in 11 days earlier for a scheduled propulsion overhaul. It was one of the newer vessels in the fleet, 94 meters long, fast, modular, and at that particular moment it was also almost completely helpless. Its diesel plant was partially disassembled, its primary generator was offline. It was drawing shore power through a cable running down the pier. It could not move, it could not maneuver, and its own close-in defenses were dependent on systems that had been powered down for maintenance. The drone was tracked visually for the last 400 meters by a sailor on the quarterdeck with a handheld searchlight and a machine gun, which is a sentence that should tell you everything about how quickly this had escalated. He hit it. 12.7 millimeter rounds punched through the fiberglass superstructure above the waterline. It did not slow down. Fiberglass drones do not care about holes. They care about the warhead staying intact and the rudder staying attached. And both did. It struck the hull at 0351 and 40 seconds, 3 meters below the waterline, 20 meters aft of the bow on the port side. The explosion was not the cinematic fireball people expect. Underwater detonations do not behave that way. The energy has nowhere to go but into the water and into the steel. And the result was a shock wave that punched a hole roughly 4 meters across through the outer hull plating, deformed 2 internal frames, and split a longitudinal bulkhead along a seam. Water entered at a rate that overwhelmed the ship's damage control pumping capacity within 90 seconds. And because the vessel was in an overhaul condition, several watertight doors that would normally have been dogged shut were open for cable runs and equipment access. The bow began to settle within 4 minutes. Because the ship was moored in shallow water alongside a pier, it did not sink in the traditional sense. It went down by the head until the bow rested on the harbor bottom, leaving the vessel canted forward and listing 8 degrees to port, still tethered to the pier by mooring lines that were now taking loads they were never designed for. 2 of them parted. The ship groaned against the fenders and stopped. And then, for about 6 minutes, nothing happened at all. This is the part of the night that the video title promises, and it is the part almost nobody talks about because what happened next was not a second explosion. It was a decision. At 0358, with a warship down by the head at berth 12, fires burning in the forward compartments, and every air defense system on the Crimean coast now fully alert, the Black Sea Fleet did what any competent Navy would do. It surged its damage control and emergency response. Fire tenders moved toward the pier. A salvage tug got underway from the southern basin. 2 truck-mounted pumping units drove out along the quay. Medical teams staged at the head of the pier. Dozens of personnel, floodlights, hoses, and vehicles concentrated into a space roughly 80 meters long and 15 meters wide. All of them focused entirely on saving a ship. 11 kilometers to the northwest, at an altitude of 140 feet, 23 fixed-wing drones were inbound at 170 kilometers per hour, and they had been in the air for over an hour. The maritime strike had never been the whole operation. It had been the alarm clock. This is a tactic with a very old name and a very ugly history. And Ukrainian planners have used it repeatedly across this war with a consistency that suggests it is doctrine rather than improvisation. You strike a target that is valuable enough that the enemy must respond. You wait for the response to physically concentrate, then you strike the response. The first weapon does damage. The second weapon does the thing that actually matters, which is making the enemy afraid to send help next time. At 0402, the coastal surveillance radar north of Sevastopol detected the inbound formation at 31 kilometers. Not clutter this time, 23 separate returns at low altitude, closing steadily. The alert went out across the network in under 20 seconds, and the Crimean air defense grid, which is genuinely one of the densest concentrations of surface-to-air systems anywhere on Earth, began to engage. It engaged well. That needs saying clearly, because the popular version of these stories tends to treat Russian air defense as though it does not exist. It exists, and on that night, it performed. A Pantsir S-1 battery on the northern approach opened fire first, using its twin 30mm cannons against targets at 4 kilometers, and its 57 E-6 missiles against those further out. 6 drones went down in the first 90 seconds. An S-400 battery further inland, which was never designed for this and could not efficiently engage targets this small and this low, still managed to bring down 2 more with 9 M96 interceptors, each of which cost more than every drone in the formation combined. But density has a mathematical limit, and it is called magazine depth. A Pantsir launcher carries 12 missiles. Reload takes minutes, not seconds. Every engagement occupies a fire channel for a finite period, and while that channel is occupied, the other targets keep flying. 9 down, 14 still inbound, and they were not all going to the same place. It is worth pausing on what that actually feels like from inside a Pantsir cabin, because the numbers hide it. 2 men, sitting side by side in a cramped vehicle, watching a screen fill with contacts faster than they can be assigned. Every launch is a decision about which target matters most, made in under 3 seconds, with no way of knowing which of the returns in front of you is carrying a warhead and which one is carrying nothing at all. Get it right, and nobody ever hears about you. Get it wrong, and a pier full of people pays for it. There is no version of that job that involves confidence. 6 broke north toward the airfield at Belbek. 4 turned east toward a fuel storage facility inland. 4 continued straight toward the harbor. That left 1, and where that one went is why anyone is still talking about this night 18 months later. The 4 inbound to the harbor arrived at 0409. 3 were engaged. 2 were destroyed over the water by a Tor M2 that had repositioned to the eastern shore, and the 3rd was hit by cannon fire and came apart 200 meters short of the seawall. The 4th got through, and it did not go for the damaged patrol ship. It went for the pier. It struck the concentration of emergency vehicles at the head of berth 12 at 0409 and 50 seconds. The 50-kilogram warhead detonated among the pumping units and the fire tender, and the effect on personnel standing in the open under floodlights in the middle of a damage control operation was exactly what you would expect, and I will not describe it further than that. The salvage effort stopped. Not paused, stopped. The men who knew how to save that ship were no longer able to save it, and the men who might have replaced them were now under standing orders not to concentrate at the pier. The patrol ship settled further overnight. By dawn, it was resting on the bottom with its main deck awash forward, and it would remain there for the better part of 3 weeks before a floating crane and a properly protected salvage operation could begin the work of raising it. The 5th drone, the one nobody accounted for, arrived at 0414 and hit the base's primary electrical distribution substation on the northern side of the harbor complex. It is not a glamorous target. There is no footage of it that looks impressive. But when it went, it took down pier-side power distribution for the entire northern anchorage, which meant shore power to 4 other moored vessels, the compressors feeding the maintenance shops, the pumps feeding the fuel transfer system, and the climate control on 2 ammunition storage buildings. Emergency generators picked up the critical loads within minutes. They did not pick up all of them, and they were never designed to run for 3 days straight, which is how long it took to restore the primary feed. Here is what Sevastopol looked like at sunrise. 1 patrol ship on the bottom at its own pier. 1 boom line severed and drifting. A substation burning. A quay closed by debris and casualties. And critically, 4 other warships that had taken no damage whatsoever and were, on paper, fully combat capable, sitting in a harbor that could no longer reliably fuel them, could no longer reliably repair them, and had just demonstrated in the most public way possible that its defenses could be opened with a $200,000 boat and a plan. That last part is what actually changed things. Within 72 hours, satellite imagery showed movement. Not damage assessment movement, departure movement. Over the following weeks, the Black Sea Fleet began relocating a significant portion of its surface combatants from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk on the Russian mainland coast, roughly 300 kilometers to the east. Submarines went too. Support vessels followed. By the end of the quarter, the anchorage that had housed Russian naval power in the Black Sea since 1783 was holding a fraction of what it had held a year earlier. Novorossiysk is a real port. It's not a bad one, but it is not Sevastopol, and the difference is not sentimental. Sevastopol has deep protected water, purpose-built naval infrastructure, dry docks, heavy repair shops, ammunition depots, and 140 years of accumulated engineering that exists specifically to keep warships fighting. Novorossiysk is primarily a commercial oil terminal that has been progressively adapted for naval use. Its repair capacity is a fraction of Sevastopol's, its berthing is more exposed to weather, and its distance from the western Black Sea means that every patrol, every escort mission, and every strike sortie now costs more fuel, more transit time, and more crew hours than it did before. None of that shows up on a damage report. All of it shows up in operational tempo. And the tempo did drop. In the 12 months following the relocation, Russian naval presence in the northwestern Black Sea, the sector that covers Ukraine's grain export corridor, declined to a level that allowed Odessa's ports to reopen and operate at volumes that had been considered impossible 18 months earlier. Ukraine, a country with no navy in any conventional sense, no destroyers, no frigates, no submarines, had achieved something close to sea denial against a fleet that outweighed it by every traditional metric. It is worth being honest about the limits here, because there's a version of this story that gets told badly. Ukraine did not sink the Black Sea fleet. Most of those ships are still afloat. The Kalibr missile strikes from the Black Sea continued, launched from further out, from safer waters, on a reduced but steady schedule. Russian air defense over Crimea remained lethal and improved substantially over time, adding netting over dry docks, dispersing high-value units, deploying trained marine mammal barriers, and layering close-in gun systems specifically tuned for surface drone defense. Later attacks against Sevastopol met far stiffer resistance and a much higher interception rate. The window that existed that night did not stay open, but the strategic point had been made, and it could not be unmade. A navy's power does not come from its ships, it comes from its ability to operate them, which means fuel, repair, ammunition, and a safe place to sit still. Take away the safe place to sit still, and the ships become liabilities. They still float, they just cannot do very much. The reason this particular night is studied is not the damage total. Measured strictly in tonnage, it was a mid-size loss. The reason it is studied is the architecture of the thing. 5 surface drones, of which only one reached the intended target, and one of the others was not even armed. A 23 aerial drones, of which 14 were destroyed before reaching anything. A total success rate, if you count it that way, of around 20%. By almost any conventional measure, that is a failed operation. Except it was not, because the operation was never designed around the survival of individual weapons. It was designed around the sequence. The first strike had to force a response. The response had to concentrate. The second strike had to arrive during that concentration. And every single element in the chain, including the ones that were destroyed, contributed to making the next element work. The drone that blew up against the boom made the gap. The drone that carried no warhead split the defender's attention. The drones that were shot down consumed missiles, fire channels, and seconds that the survivors then used. Attrition was not a failure mode. Attrition was the budget. There's a Russian officer somewhere who did everything correctly that night. He classified the initial contact according to established procedure and was right by every standard he had been trained against. There is a gunner who put rounds on target with a system that performed to specification and still could not stop what was coming, because the physics of traverse rate and closure speed did not care how good he was. There is a damage control officer who made the textbook decision to surge every available resource to a sinking ship, which was the correct decision under every doctrine written before 2022, and which cost him his people. That is the uncomfortable part of this story, and it is the part that makes it worth 30 minutes of anyone's time. Nobody involved was incompetent. The defenses were not hollow. The problem was that an entire century of naval-based security had been built around the assumption that the threats worth defending against would be expensive, few, and detectable, and that assumption stopped being true somewhere around 2023, quietly, without anyone announcing it. Every Navy on Earth read the after-action reports. The U.S. Navy accelerated its counter-USV programs. NATO ports began revising harbor security protocols that had gone essentially unchanged since the attack on the USS Cole. China ran its own assessments of Taiwanese Strait vulnerabilities and came away, according to open-source analysis, considerably less comfortable than it had been, because the lesson was not about Russia. The lesson was that a harbor is a fixed point. A warship and a pier is a stationary target, and stationary targets in the age of cheap autonomous weapons are a category of problem nobody has solved. The doctrinal change that came out of it is smaller than people expect and more painful than it sounds. Damage control surges are now staggered rather than massed. Response teams arrive in waves from dispersed staging points, accepting that the ship is more likely to be lost in exchange for the people not being. That is a genuinely awful trade to write into a procedure manual, and several navies resisted writing it for as long as they could. They wrote it anyway, because the alternative had already been demonstrated in front of everyone at Berkeley 12. Sevastopol still functions. Ships still move through it. The boom has been repaired and reinforced, doubled in places, backed by additional netting and acoustic sensors that would almost certainly catch the same approach today. The substation was rebuilt with hardened protection. The lessons were absorbed, expensively, the way lessons in this domain always are. But the fleet did not come back. Not fully. And the harbor that Catherine the Great built as the permanent anchor of Russian power on the Black Sea now spends a great deal of its time holding water where warships used to be. The last thing worth saying is about the numbers, because the numbers are the entire argument. The 5 surface vessels used that night cost, in total, roughly $1 million to build. The aerial drones, perhaps another $600,000. Call it $1.6 million for the whole package, before crew, planning, and delivery. The interceptor missiles fired in defense that night cost several times that figure by themselves. The patrol ship on the bottom of the harbor represented $80 to $90 million in construction value alone. The substation, the pier repairs, the salvage operation, the 3 weeks of lost berth capacity, the relocation of an entire fleet to a port 300 kilometers away, and the permanent restructuring of Black Sea naval operations do not have a clean price tag, but it is not a small one. That is the exchange rate that Ukraine discovered and that everyone else is now scrambling to survive. Not a technological breakthrough, not a wonder weapon, just an economic asymmetry so severe that it makes the entire concept of a capital ship in a confined sea look like a question rather than an answer. Somewhere in a warehouse right now, someone is bolting an outboard motor to a fiberglass hull that costs less than a family car. And in 6 weeks, it will be sitting off a coastline, drifting, waiting for a timing window that has already been calculated. That is what the night of the Sevastopol strike actually changed. Not one ship, the arithmetic. And arithmetic does not negotiate.